Hello, hi, how are you? I hope you guys are having an amazing day today. Hello! So today's video, first of all, candle of the day. One day I'll get it right, or I don't say so. Today's video first. Candle of the day today is Bath & Body Works Stress Relief. It's from their aromatherapy line. I needed some stress relief today, so we have this going, and I'm really hoping, fingers crossed, it works. Before we jump into today's video, I did just want to say this video has a sponsor! I'm actually really excited about this sponsor. This was another one that reached out to me, and I legitimately already used their services. I've been using their services for about 6 months. So this video is sponsored by HelloFresh. Roll the little ad I made. I'm very proud of the sponsorship that I made, so please like it.
So at the beginning of quarantine, my fiance and I were really in a rut on food. We were cooking at home literally all of the time, and we were getting very bored. So at the recommendation of some of our friends, we tried HelloFresh, and oh my god, it's America's #1 meal kit for a reason. First of all, I can't stress enough how delicious these meals are. They are so good. Tonight we were making some like pork tacos that were absolutely delicious, like so incredibly yummy. You guys know I don't like peppers, but HelloFresh tells you the ingredients that are spicy and the ones that aren't. So I was able to pick up the peppers, and I absolutely loved the tacos. The thing I especially love is the time that it takes. So this one probably took us about 20 minutes, and I would say on average they take 20 to 30 minutes, but they do have a quick recipe option that allows you to get things done even faster. So it's perfect for just like if you've had a long day, you just need to cook some food. Perfect, easy meals to make that don't take a lot of time. Probably my absolute most favorite part about HelloFresh is how sustainably it allows you to live. I absolutely love that I'm not overbuying or wasting food. What you get in the box is exactly what you need to cook, and that gives you the perfect portions to create your meals without creating any waste. So if you're interested, you can go to HelloFresh.com and use my code SmokeyGlow90 to get $90 off, including free shipping on your very first box. I love HelloFresh, cannot rave about them enough. Go enjoy!
Cheers. This is super legit. Thank you so much to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. I really appreciate it. And without further ado, let's jump into it. Today's video is another evolution of videos. It's kind of a continuation of a series I've been doing on my channel. I did create an evolution of playlist now, so if you want to go through and watch all the other ones I made, you can do that. I finally decided to do my job. So today's video, we're going to be doing the evolution of Morphe. Before I even get into this video, I feel like it's very important to preface that Morphe as a brand has somewhat of a shady history, allegedly. And it's honestly a little bit difficult to find information on Morphe. I did a lot of Googling, and I really tried to put together the best possible timeline and also put in all of the information I could find, but it really is difficult to find any sort of anything on the brand. They don't even have a Wikipedia page. Like, it was really a lot to try to pull info from this, so I really had to utilize other resources from other YouTubers and things like that. So there's a ton of videos that I used as kind of a jumping off point and a reference point for this video, and I'll make sure to link all of those videos down below because all of those creators really helped get all of this put together. And with that being said, let's get right into this. Morphe Brushes was created in 2008 by the brother and sister duo Linda and Chris Tawil. Now, Morphe actually started out under the name Morphe Brushes and was initially only a brush selling company. That was kind of their shtick. That was all they did. And I have to say, right off the bat, there is a bit of controversy surrounding the origins of Morphe that I feel like is really pertinent to talk about to kind of give you building blocks on why today they kind of seem like a very shady company to a lot of people. Kind of that shady includes their practice of private labeling their brushes. Now, before I even get into like all of this, I do want to preface this whole thing by saying I don't think private labeling is a bad thing. I don't think brands private labeling is a bad thing. I think it's a really great way for brands to get a head start. And I also think it's a useful tool, especially for smaller brands just starting out. And I don't fault Morphe inherently for private labeling. It's actually a very common practice amongst even massive brands, which I think is a little shady, but I don't fault them for utilizing using private labeling in the beginning of their business. I want to make that very clear because there's a lot of, especially small makeup brands, who utilize private labeling to get their start, and then as they grow, start making more individualized formulas for their products. What I will say is I think there is a big difference between taking already pre-made shadows and creating your own color stories and creating your own packaging concepts that are super interesting and doing all of that. I think there's a big difference between that and doing what Morphe does, which is basically just cutting costs at all ends and taking already cheap palettes and selling them for a slightly higher markup and not changing them around in the slightest and just reselling them for a higher cost and saying they have value because they have a name on them. So Morphe has never publicly confirmed that I can find that they were in fact private labeled in the beginning. However, YouTuber Stephanie Nicole in 2016 put out an entire video really detailing about Morphe and their practices, and what she found is pretty compelling evidence that Morphe was in fact, at least up until 2016, private labeled through a company called Crown Brushes. I want to just preface this by saying I feel like Stephanie Nicole deserves so much credit for finding all of this information and figuring this out, because up until this point, there was really no clue that anything about Morphe was even remotely shady. And while I feel like the concept of private labeling now in 2020 is pretty common knowledge, like I feel like a lot of people know what that means, in 2016 that absolutely was not the case, and especially in 2008 when Morphe started, nobody really knew about private labeling. Basically what is theorized is that in 2008 when Morphe started their company, they basically just bought brushes wholesale from Crown Brushes and just sold them as Morphe brushes. It's speculated in the beginning that while Morphe did change the name on the handle of the brush from Crown to Morphe, they didn't actually change over the number code that was on the brushes. So now if you get a Morphe brush, it has like M39, like that's the brush code on it. Back in 2008 when they first came out with the brushes, they had a C in front of them and the brush codes all started with C. So it'd be like C128 or something. This was proven because in their FAQ section, they had people asking questions about if their brushes had a brush code that had a C in them, were they still legitimately Morphe brushes because they started putting M's in front of all of their brushes after they started getting bigger. And Morphe confirmed that they were just going through a rebrand and that brushes with C were in fact still legitimate Morphe brushes. Now this was pointed out by Stephanie Nicole in 2016, and since then that FAQ question has been deleted off of Morphe's website. This is kind of the most compelling evidence that Morphe wasn't even changing the brush code from Crown Brushes. And the other reason people think they're private labeled through Crown is because you can find multiple examples of Crown brushes and Morphe brushes that look exactly the same. They are identical brushes. They're made from similar materials. They look identical. They even had some collections where they had like a gunmetal collection that was these like chrome brush handles, and Crown also had those available for wholesale. So what it appeared Morphe was doing was buying those Crown brushes wholesale, getting the name Morphe screen printed on them, and then selling them. It also appears that later down the line when Morphe started making makeup palettes, they did pretty much the exact same thing. They took pre-existing Crown brushes palettes, switched around a couple of shades, and then resold them, except they were branded as Morphe palettes instead of Crown palettes. Okay, so basically for legal reasons, I cannot say from 2008 to like 2014, I can't say that Morphe was private labeled by Crown like 100% for legal reasons, but I will say it's very heavily implied that they were working with Crown. Also, a channel called Illuminati, who did a really good deep dive into Morphe as well, found information that there was actually an alleged lawsuit between Morphe and Crown Brushes because Crown Brushes was trying to use websites like Morphe.com. Morphe did win that lawsuit and Crown Brushes is no longer allowed to use those websites, but it does show that there is some little connection to them, which again doesn't prove that they were being private labeled through them, but again, this is kind of a heavily speculated theory in the community. Even though this is standard business practice, buying a bulk of products at wholesale and then reselling them, the reason it was like particularly shady with Morphe is because not only were they buying them at a much cheaper price and then reselling them, which, you know, that is business, not only were they doing that, they were reselling them for about $2 to $3 more than what Crown Brushes was commercially selling their products for. So you could, as a basic consumer not trying to buy in bulk, go and buy Crown Brushes for $9, or you could go to Morphe, which was a lot more well-known and well-established, and buy their brushes for $12, even though they were the exact same brush, allegedly made by the exact same people. And while while we can't know for sure if Morphe was actually being private labeled through Crown, it's almost 100% certain that they were being private labeled by somebody and they're buying their brushes through somebody else in the beginning stages of the brand from about 2008 until about 2010, 11, 12. It's very hard to find dates about Morphe. So excluding that preface of kind of what we ended up finding out eventually, Morphe in the very beginning actually started selling at trade shows. They would go to beauty trade shows. I read an article about the brother and sister duo, Linda and Chris, that started the company, and basically they said in the beginning they would go to 20 to 30 trade shows a year, which is actually a ton if you think about it. They happen on weekends. So basically every other weekend they were going to some type of trade show. They said in the very early stages they really did anything they could to cut costs, which made me chuckle a little bit. But I think they more meant like because they didn't have a lot of money for the brand at first, instead of flying out to these different places, Chris specifically would be driving all across the country to different trade shows every weekend. He would rent a U-Haul and like load stuff up and just drive everything everywhere to cut costs. And Linda said at certain points, Chris would literally be gone for like a month at a time, just doing these trade shows, trying to build up Morphe's clientele. I think that actually this strategy of selling at trade shows first was really, really smart. I know some other brands do this too. I think it was a really smart idea because Morphe's whole shtick from the get-go was that they were makeup that you could get a lot of for an affordable price, and their brushes were no different. Even though their brush sets were still around the like $60 to $100 range, for makeup brushes, especially ones that are being sold and marketed as like professional grade, high quality makeup brushes, that's actually a relatively good deal for all the brushes that you were able to get in a set. And if you think about it, a lot of people that went to these trade shows, while a lot of them were probably experienced makeup artists, a lot of them were probably also makeup artists who were just starting out, just trying to build a kit. And I think they were able to build a really strong clientele by doing this because they marketed to people who wanted to do makeup artistry but needed to build their kits at an affordable rate. Morphe definitely started out in the industry by doing very competitive pricing, and while I think that's kind of pittered off in recent years, that is definitely what made them very popular in the beginning, was how competitive that pricing was. And while technically you could buy Crown brushes for cheaper, people did not know that because Crown brushes weren't marketing in the same way that Morphe was. So Morphe seemed like a very, very good deal. So it's really hard to tell when Morphe actually made the switch from doing just brushes to doing makeup. And I know that this is a very large time frame. So if somebody who like was really into makeup at the time can tell me, that would be great. But it seems like it happened around the 2012 to 2013 years when they switched from just brushes to actually doing eyeshadow palettes as well. And it seems like when they started, it was mostly eyeshadow palettes and concealer palettes that they were selling. Again, it's important to note that it's very heavily speculated that these first few rounds of 35 pan eyeshadow palettes, that's kind of what made them so popular in the beginning, were in fact private labeled eyeshadow palettes. And not only were they private labeled, but it appears, based on everything we know now, that instead of taking private labeled shadows and creating unique color stories, Morphe really was just picking what Crown had already made for them, switching it around a little bit, and then reselling it in just as cheap and chintzy packaging, sometimes even cheaper packaging than Crown brushes offered, because a lot of times Crown brush palettes had mirrors inside of them, whereas Morphe's were just that standard plastic container. I don't think it can be talked about enough how big these 35 pan palettes were, especially in the time of like 2014-ish. These became really, really huge because it was something really unique in the sense that you could get 35 shadows for $21, and they were being sold again as makeup artistry level palettes. That's how beauty influencers were kind of pushing these palettes at the time in the 2013-2014 era, was this was made for makeup artists now being marketed to consumers. As far as what the palettes actually looked like, based on what I could find, the beginning stages of the brand, again, it was really just, I hate to say it because it's kind of how Morphe is now, but it was really just a lot of repetitive brown colors in massive palettes with some pops of color. So you had like the 35O, the 35G, the 35P, the 35C, which was a colorful palette, so that was a little bit different for them. But again, it was just these really, really large 35 pan palettes that did really well. And the 35O was probably their first palette that got like a lot of success, a huge amount of success. While I disagree with a lot of the way Morphe went about things, you can't really deny how smart they were in terms of marketing. Even doing something as simple as marketing their palettes as the 35 blank palette was super genius, because number one, it tells you right off the bat how many, it's literally staring you in the face how much eyeshadow you're going to get and how much variety that you're going to get. And also, it was very reminiscent of how professional makeup brands labeled their stuff. The whole vibe that they gave off from the get was that they were a brand for professional makeup artists, and I think they probably learned how to market themselves like that by doing all of these trade shows and seeing how more professional grade makeup companies marketed themselves to makeup artists. I think their whole idea of making it seem like you as the everyday consumer could have the same types of products that makeup artists use was a really unique idea at the time, and also the fact that they were offering that and also offering low prices, I think really made them stand out as a brand in the beginning. I think the brand really started picking up steam in 2014. That's when they started really putting out products and started actually becoming more well known through social media. I would argue that Morphe is probably one of the most successful social media brands so far in our time. They were not one of the first brands to utilize social media, but they were one of the first brands to be as successful as they were by using influencers and social media to promote their brand. They've admitted that themselves. Linda and Chris have openly said that social media is pretty much the biggest reason they were able to grow the way that they were able to. They used this term that's hashtag Morphe babes, and anybody that worked with them and anybody that was affiliated with them and all of the influencers that had codes with them were Morphe babes. They were featured on the Morphe website. They were later put up in Morphe stores. They had a strong connection and saw the value in YouTubers and makeup gurus before pretty much any other brands really did. So they had the people like Manny MUA, Jaclyn Hill, Laura Lee. They got all of them kind of at the beginning of when this rise of influencer marketing started, and I think that also really helped them. A lot of these influencers still have very strong loyalties to Morphe as a brand, and you don't often see that with influencers nowadays. It's very clear that they treated their influencers very well from the start and built more than just business relationships with the people that they worked with. So in 2015 is when they did kind of their first influencer palette, and it was unsurprisingly with Jaclyn Hill. This doesn't seem to be a very hyped launch. I know it's sold out, and I know a lot of people were talking about it at the time. I found a ton of videos doing reviews on this in 2015, but this was called the Jaclyn Hill Favorites palette, and this to me shows that I think 2015 was when they were starting to phase out of private labeling, but when they were still most definitely private labeling. Jaclyn Hill basically said this palette was marketed as she picked her favorite Morphe shadows and put them all in one palette, which implies to me that they were pre-made shadows that she just like kind of picked from a catalog. So this was her like favorites palette. In 2016, they actually did a collaboration with Kathleen Lights, which I completely forgot about before I was doing this video. I totally forgot that she did a palette with Morphe that was actually super sought after at the time. It feels like, especially in 2016, I remember this sold out very quickly. It was very difficult to get. People were buying it secondhand. And I remember when it officially like went out of stock and they stopped selling it, people were selling the actual palette for a much larger markup on secondhand seller websites because the palette was so hyped up. Now, being a Morphe babe came along, a hashtag Morphe babe came along with a lot of things, and probably the most prominent was a 10% off code to Morphe. Now, I cannot stress enough, Morphe was not the first brand ever to do affiliate codes, and they are most certainly not the last brand, but they were absolutely the most prominent and the most shilled is probably the best word. It became somewhat of a joke in the 2016 makeup community of these like Morphe babes constantly pushing their Morphe codes, because it felt like with every new release of a similar toned neutral brown palette, every single person on that Morphe babe list would post a video about it, would push their code, would push their followers into talking about it. It felt like every makeup tutorial somewhere, someone had a Morphe product in it, and it really did feel like the brand was kind of always being pushed. People didn't really know what affiliate codes were back in 2014. Well, again, I think it's very common knowledge now what affiliate code means, and that means that a person's getting like a kickback. While I would say that's pretty common knowledge now, I do not think that was common knowledge back in 2014. FTC really hadn't hammered down on social media influencers quite yet, and YouTube was still kind of the wild west of marketing. A lot of people were not fully disclosing and being transparent, including Morphe, about what the term affiliate actually meant. So while people knew it was like use my code, people people weren't 100% aware of the fact that if you used that person's code, that person would get a large kickback from you using that code. I want to preface I feel like there's so many prefaces in this video, but these are very complicated topics, I think. I don't think it's a bad thing for influencers to make a kickback on products that they recommend people. I don't. I think you need to be very, very honest and transparent with your audience that you are receiving that kickback, because it could in turn make you a little bit biased when talking about those products. Back in 2014 to like 2016, people thought that everybody was pushing Morphe products because Morphe was legitimately the best makeup you could buy. Because we didn't know how much money people were making from Morphe codes, we assumed that everybody was just talking about it so much because they loved the palettes, they loved the makeup, they loved the brushes, they were the best in the game, and that's why every influencer was obsessed with them. I think had people known back in 2014 that there was probably a strong bias there because these influencers were making rumored to be like 6 figures a month from just Morphe codes, I think people probably would have been a little bit more skeptical of those reviews and probably would have taken them with less weight because they probably had a bias to them. Now, I'm not entirely sure who to blame in the instance of the Morphe affiliate code issue, because obviously the influencers were not being transparent, but Morphe as a brand was also not being transparent and was very obviously not encouraging transparency among their influencers. So while I do think some of the blowback falls on the influencers for not being honest, I also think that the brand should be held responsible for not forcing or encouraging their influencers to be more transparent about the affiliate process. This was all kind of blown up for Morphe, this kind of illusion that they just happened to be the best of the best, and that's why everybody was talking about them. This was all kind of blown up in 2016 by a drama channel named Here for the Tea. Here for the Tea really exposed and blew this entire situation up. Like, she really was one of the first drama channels to actually do this kind of investigative work into figuring out why people were constantly pushing Morphe and what the affiliate codes mean, and she broke it down for people. And these videos got so many views. They were insanely popular, they were widely shared, and more importantly, the information in the videos were widely shared. Sam explained that the discount was really worked into the price of every single Morphe palette. So every single palette was about 20% more than it actually needed to be to make an impressive cost. Like, their cost margins were about 20% more than they needed to be. And that was because if you used an influencer code, the person would technically be getting 10% off, but the influencer would also be getting a kickback of 10% from every single sale. So basically the money that you saved went to the influencer. It was jarring to hear that your favorite influencers were potentially pushing something onto you that maybe wasn't the best quality just because they knew it would make them a lot of money. And it really started to add up because a lot of people had done very critical reviews of Morphe who weren't #Morphe babes, and they actually got a lot of pushback and a lot of blowback from these Morphe influencers. It also felt like no matter what product came out, everybody was comparing it to Morphe. So if an orange toned eyeshadow palette came out, everyone would be like, well, this is a great one, but you should check out the 35O for Morphe. I remember when Kylie came out with her Kylie brushes, there was like 4 different influencers who made a Kylie brushes compared to Morphe brushes video and basically just said Morphe brushes were 1,000 times better and pushed those brushes on people instead of the Kylie brushes. Granted, the Kylie brushes were ridiculously expensive, but still. This gave Morphe, and especially in 2016, a very, very bad reputation as the shilling brand. Nobody really trusted influencers who talked about Morphe. Here's kind of the caveat though. It's very easy to be like, well, nobody trusted them and everybody lost a lot of faith in them and they were known as the shill brand. Like, it's very easy to say that. However, there is a little asterisk that only the people who really knew about that and were into YouTube drama channels and were into YouTube drama in general, only those people knew about it, which, while a probably substantial number of people based on video views, that's not like everyone who uses makeup. That's not everyone who watches channels with #Morphe babes. So while I'm sure it was a very large deal for like us who were in it with the makeup community, and while the YouTube makeup community pretty against Morphe, I think it's very important to note that the YouTube beauty community only makes up a small percentage of the just beauty community in the world. And Morphe Morphe was still doing fine with those people, because if you were a person who watched like Laura Lee casually, you had no idea about the drama that was going on with Morphe codes, and she was still pushing those products, so people still believed them. So while this definitely hurt their credibility with a portion of their demographic, I think the reason they were able to prevail past this, and why a lot of brands frankly are able to prevail past sort of shady business practices, is because the YouTube beauty community does not represent consumers as a whole. We're a lot more nitpicky over here on YouTube. Now, I think 2017 is kind of when a lot started to change for Morphe. For 2016, while I think they weren't really private labeled anymore, they kept that same sort of black plastic packaging with the basic logo on the front. Their price point was ridiculously the same across the board. Every 35 pan shadow was like $21. And also the palettes themselves were just very similar. Like that was kind of their whole thing through 2016. But 2017, that did start to change a little bit. They have the 25B palette, which, while, you know, just still kind of golds and neutrals and browns, these palettes were really raved about, and they were different from normal Morphe palettes. They were $25, but they had this like clear cover on them. They had a little bit more different packaging, and you could tell that Morphe was trying to sort of change things up with what they were doing, because the 35 pan palettes were very obviously, while very popular, getting very redundant. It also seems like in 2017, the quality of their formula did change. Seems like they went from having really hit or miss formulas to actually having a more consistent formula from their mattes to their shimmers. Like everything just seemed more consistent. Now, in 2017, it was also kind of a pivotal time, because that is when Morphe launched the OG, not the favorites, OG Jaclyn Hill palette was launched in 2017. Now, I really think that Morphe, if they're not already like I know Morphe already pays her like a ton of money, but like really Morphe owes pretty much all of their success and everything they have now to Jaclyn Hill. I think that's the reason they keep giving her collabs and they keep working with her and they keep supporting her, is because they owe so much to her. She was one of the original Morphe babes, and this palette really took Morphe to a whole other level. Earlier, right before the Jaclyn Hill palette launched, Morphe started being sold at Ulta in 2017, which was a really huge move. And honestly, knowing kind of what we've seen about business and brands, I would imagine that that move was able to happen not only because of the success they had had in 2016 with their more standard palettes, but I would imagine that that move was kind of contingent on the Jaclyn Hill palette, because it was very shortly before that palette launched that that change into Ulta happened. And it seemed like Morphe could have really said, hey, we have this influencer. She's had a history with other brands like Becca of selling out of products in brick and mortar stores ridiculously fast. You're going to make a lot of money. We're going to make a lot of money. Put us in your stores too, to make this palette more accessible. I think that was probably part of the plan, just given the timing of how close those two things were. So I would imagine that the Jaclyn Hill collab had a lot to do with how Morphe made its way into Ulta initially. And this Jaclyn Hill palette was huge. I mean, over the years, it's sold over 1 million palettes now. Jaclyn Hill has recently claimed that they still sell thousands of palettes a month without her even mentioning it. And this palette got rave reviews, like across the board. I do believe that the Jaclyn Hill palette wasn't private labeled. I do believe that it was Morphe's own formula, but there, of course, because it's Morphe, and with every big thing they do, there is a little bit of scandal surrounding this. Number one, Crown Brushes does have a palette that's pretty much identical to the Jaclyn Hill palette. It's called their OMG palette. Jaclyn claims that this palette came out after the Jaclyn Hill palette originally launched, and it was kind of made as like a dupe palette to her palette. It was copying them. I am inclined to believe that to be true, and unfortunately there's not really a way to tell which palette came first, but I would be inclined to believe that Jaclyn Hill palette came first and then that dupe sort of followed, just because there were a ton of smaller private label brands trying to dupe the Jaclyn Hill palette after it came out because it was so ridiculously popular. Aside from that, there's also been scandal in recent years with the Jaclyn Hill palette. A YouTuber named Jen Loves Reviews kind of exposed this whole situation last year when she discovered that the formulation on the Jaclyn Hill palette was changed. While you might not think that this would be a massive deal, because brands can change their formulas over the years, like it happens, brands reformulate. The reason that this was such a big deal was because when the Jaclyn Hill palette initially came out, it was marketed as a vegan product. It's very important to note, because number one, the products that were listed on the palette and the ingredients, and knowing that it was vegan helps people who might have allergies not buy a palette like that. So if a palette has, I believe the ingredient was carmine, a lot of people are allergic to that, so if they hear that it's vegan, they assume that carmine is not in that palette and that it's okay to buy because it's vegan. Morphe decided to change the palette so it did include that ingredient. Not only is that like a dangerous situation that people think it's one way and then it's another way, that's really unethical. To have people think that a product is vegan and a product they're buying is vegan, which means a lot to a lot of people. Like a lot lot of people really pride themselves on shopping ethically in that way. And a lot of people feel very passionately that animal products should not be used in makeup. To change that without making it abundantly clear to consumers that the palette was no longer vegan, and to change that kind of behind the scenes, so much so that Jaclyn Hill even claims she had no idea that that formula change was made, is incredibly unethical. This again is kind of just mounting evidence against Morphe of the shady business practices that they partake in. Only after Jen Loves Reviews video get really big did the brand decide to make a statement announcing that the product was no longer vegan, but at that point it was unclear when the product had actually changed, so people had no idea if they actually bought the vegan palette or if they didn't, which is really messed up, honestly. That's arguably, like, a lot of the things they've done I disagree with, but that one is probably the worst, because messing with people's like morals like that and putting people in danger who might have allergic reactions just doesn't sit right with me. That's like gross negligence, honestly. Sorry there's so much jumping around in this video, but I feel like it's really important for context. Going back to 2017, they also launched their 39A palette, and this palette was very different. They put actually like a really nice design on the front. It wasn't just their logo slapped on like a plastic thing. Had a really beautiful design to it, and they used a similar cardboard to the Jaclyn Hill palette. This palette was also a big deal because the color story was very interesting. The middle pans were all these like massive sized pans, and they had a ton of different colors everywhere. It was overall actually a really gorgeous palette, and it was a nice step in a different direction from kind of the standard privately labeled stuff that we had seen. It seemed like there was actually some creativity and thought put into this by the Morphe team. I think had these two products, the Jaclyn Hill palette and the 39A, not come out in 2017, I think it would have been really hard for the brand to build back their kind of reputation with the YouTube beauty community, because people had seen Stephanie Nicole's video, they had seen Here for the Teas video, and overall Morphe was seeming like really poor quality and really sketchy. So with the Jaclyn Hill palette and the 39A getting such rave reviews kind of across the board from, you know, non-Morphe babes and Morphe babes alike, I think it gave Morphe back a lot of their credibility with the YouTube community. It also seems like in 2017 Morphe started carrying other brands. So they started carrying Jeffree Star Cosmetics, Iconic London, P. Louise, and they started becoming not only their own makeup company retailer, but also selling other more influencer, smaller brands. Now, I forgot to mention this, I'm so sorry, but in 2013, Morphe opened their very first brick and mortar store in California, and they expanded to about 2, but 2018 was when those store openings really started to explode. They started opening brick and mortar stores pretty much across America and in the UK and other countries. I think this is a really interesting decision in general. They're still actively like opening new stores all of the time, and I think that's just super interesting because for an influencer-based brand and kind of an online-based brand, would have been very, very easy for them to just stay online, to just sell through Ulta and keep their business predominantly online. I feel like in a time when brick and mortar stores are kind of leaving and people are pulling out of that and focusing on online, it's a very weird choice to me that they chose to sell in store and open all of these new stores. However, something that I think is very interesting is that because they did carry Jeffree Star Cosmetics and they had a lot of his palettes in store, Morphe stores were the only place you could go and buy physical Jeffree Star Cosmetics products in person, and I think that was kind of a driving force to the stores. So I have to wonder what's going to happen now in 2020 with the brand, you know? They're expanding range of products and people starting to give them really good reviews again because their quality of products was being up. The brand absolutely was coming back from that sort of stigma that surrounded them in 2016 in the YouTube beauty community. And then the Jaclyn Hill Vault collection entered the chat. I already talked ad nauseum in my Jaclyn Hill video about the Jaclyn Hill Vault collection fiasco, but just to give a brief overview, Morphe decided to do another collaboration with Jaclyn Hill called the Vault collection. The Vault collection was basically 4 smaller palettes that made up colors that they felt were missing from the original Jaclyn Hill palette. So colors that Jaclyn wanted to put in, but just couldn't for whatever reason. You had like a green and yellow palette, a purple palette, a red palette. What was the 4th one? Oh, the dark one. You had like a really dark one. Sorry. I just had a total brain freeze. I was like, wait, what did they look like? So they announced this launch and then promptly set out PR to all of their influencers. It seemed like another normal like Jaclyn Hill Morphe launch. And influencers started to get the PR and the reviews were coming in really, really bad. People were really hating the palettes. They were saying they were poor quality. And Jaclyn Hill and Morphe made the collective decision to not launch the palettes at the time they were supposed to because there were inconsistency issues across the board board with the palettes. So they decided to hold off on the launch, fix the palettes, and then relaunch. 6 weeks after making that announcement, they announced that they were ready to launch. And there was so much drama around this just because, number one, a lot of people who worked in the makeup industry were like, there is literally physically no way they could have made that many palettes and fixed everything and like made everything right in 6 weeks. Like, this process takes a really long time. If they actually started from scratch all over again, remaking like 100,000 units of these palettes, there's just physically no way they could have made it and had them be ready to sell in 6 weeks. The other problem was, once these new palettes came out, they were also still getting horrible reviews. They were having very similar problems, and there was just a lot of batch code issues. A lot of the palettes had the batch code V2 on them, and then a lot of the palettes didn't. So a lot of people felt like they were selling some of the OG palettes, and then they were selling some of these new palettes that they put out, and they were just mixing them all together and like hoping for the best. Also, just there's been a lot of conflicting stories about what happened with all of those old palettes. At first it was said they were quarantined and studied and like never sold or touched, but then it was also said that they reused the packaging on some of them and that they like pulled out the bad shades and put in new ones. It was a whole very weird scandal. In 2018, when this happened, Morphe had really been rebuilding their reputation, and this kind of just tore all of that back down again because there was so much drama surrounding them. But again, that was only if you were into the YouTube drama community, which, while at the time was probably much bigger than it had been in 2016, still was only made up a portion of the makeup market. I think people felt really cheated by these palettes, honestly, and just kind of scammed by the whole situation. And it again just showed that Morphe really lacks a level of transparency that is kind of needed when you run a makeup brand. I will say, I think that the James Charles palette launching later in the year in 2018 was kind of a saving grace for the brand, because that palette was incredibly successful. The palette sold out in like 10 minutes. It was one of the most sought after palettes. It was being remade. People were reselling it for so much money. People were selling fakes. Like, everybody wanted it for Christmas. Like, the James Charles palette was arguably one of the biggest palettes that Morphe has ever had. I think it actually is bigger than the Jaclyn Hill palette. Again, that palette got pretty good reviews across the board. So while you had this disaster with the Vault collections, the James Charles palette kind of counteracted that and made it so that the brand gained a little bit more credibility again and gained a little bit more popularity again. However, because it's Morphe, of course, there's some controversy here. It's very, very confusing if the James Charles palette is actually vegan or not. And this was put into question a lot, but there was a lot of research done by people who initially the palette was claimed to be vegan by Morphe and also via the ingredients list, but then it was later found out that they actually hid the ingredient carmine into the formula without like letting people know. Like, they put it under a name that it's not normally found under, alert you to the fact that it's in there, but it's not a commonly known name for that ingredient. So while they were saying it was vegan and they were trying to claim it was vegan, once you were able to put in like all of the actual ingredients, it was found to be a not vegan palette. And that brings up a whole other slew of issues behind Morphe's cruelty-free status. I think it's far too easy for brands to lie about their cruelty-free status because there's really no way of fact-checking if a brand is or is not actually cruelty-free. And again, the YouTuber Illuminati went into this in depth in her video, but basically discovered that while Morphe like might be cruelty-free, they do send product into mainland China to be sold, which would imply that it's not cruelty-free. And also, just in general, Morphe will never really give a straight answer on if they test on animals or if they don't for whatever reason, which again should be something that is easy to be transparent about, because it's either yes we do or no we don't. It seems like Morphe is a brand that definitely bends the truth. I think they're aware of the ramifications of not being a cruelty-free brand, or aware of the ramifications of not being a vegan brand, and so they try really hard to fit into that, even though they're not actually cruelty-free or vegan, allegedly. So I think that's kind of interesting. 2018, I also feel like, was the year of Morphe store openings being somewhat of influencer meet and greets. They started flying their most prominent Morphe babes like James Charles, Jeffree Star, Jaclyn Hill. They started flying all these people out across the country to different store locations to be their store openers. So you had all these like influencers cutting ribbons and you had tens of thousands of people crowding the malls to meet their favorite influencer. So not only was this like a huge probably ego boost for influencers and made them feel really good at the hand of Morphe because they had thousands of like adoring fans screaming for them thanks to Morphe. Not only that, but it brought in tens of thousands of people to Morphe and it made people even more aware of the brand. For example, when Morphe opened a store in the UK and had James Charles there, he actually shut down a certain part of London because it was so crowded because so many people went and attended this store opening with him, and that put Morphe in the main headlines. Utilizing the hype around influencers was absolutely part of their marketing, and it worked pretty flawlessly, honestly. You can knock them for a lot of things, but their influencer marketing, while shady and deceitful, was incredibly impressive in how well they executed it. Also in 2019, Morphe went ahead and launched a base collection, so they launched foundations and concealers and like powders, and I believe a primer. I think this kind of goes along with the like cruelty-free and vegan thing just because they know that it'll like make them seem good. Morphe put out 60 shades of foundation, which in theory you would think is like great, they're trying to be inclusive, but the reality was the shade range itself still wasn't inclusive, which kind of just goes to show you can put out 20 shades and if it's a good spectrum, that's all that matters. It kind of showed the performativeness behind a lot of what Morphe did, and while this wasn't like a huge scandal, I think it definitely made people like, are you kidding? 60 shades, like went above and beyond, still couldn't find a shade for everyone. And also the formula on that concealer and foundation was heavily criticized. Even like Morphe babes couldn't really push that formula. I saw almost none of them talking positively about this product in particular because it was really one of Morphe's worst launches to date. Nobody really liked the foundation and concealer as far as the YouTube world went. Now, 2019 also kind of started their collabing with literally everyone and putting out collabs with everybody and putting out a ton of releases. Like they did the Jeffree Star collection, they had one with Manny in 2019, and kind of if we're doing like no nuance November opinions, I'm just gonna leave this opinion here and go. But basically Morphe is the same as ColourPop, where they put out a ton of releases, like far too many. They collab with tons of people on random stuff that doesn't always have the most thought put into it. Like sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And the only reason Morphe isn't as called out about it as ColourPop is because the expectation for Morphe is already set pretty low. Like the bar is basically under the floorboards. So people really don't have a lot of high expectations for Morphe. So this behavior goes relatively unchecked. Unlike with ColourPop where people have higher expectations for the brand. So that's why they get called out for it more. But as far as their sort of business model and how they do things, ColourPop and Morphe are incredibly similar. 2019 was also an interesting year for them because they were very heavily featured in the Shane Dawson and Jeffree Star like beauty community documentary. Like it showed them going to the Morphe store openings multiple times. It showed them on the phone with Morphe, talked about Morphe a ton. And I think this actually, while probably a good thing at the time because Morphe probably got a lot of sales from that, I think ended up being a very bad thing because in 2020 when Shane Dawson and Jeffree Star's careers kind of imploded after a series of long drawn out events, Morphe was heavily associated with the two. It was actually speculated at the time that Jeffree Star owned shares in Morphe because the two were so closely affiliated, and that affiliation with Morphe and in turn Shane Dawson really bit the brand in the ass, honestly, and they had to backtrack pretty hard. They made a really astonishing decision in 2020 to actually stop selling Jeffree Star cosmetics, which while I'm sure is not a huge hit for Jeffree Star cosmetics, I imagine is going to be a big hit for Morphe as a brand. Because like I said, a lot of people went into their brick and mortar stores because of the exclusivity that Jeffree Star Cosmetics brought to them. I'm interested to see, that one hasn't played out yet, obviously because of COVID, we have no idea, but I'm very, very interested to see how that decision to disassociate from Jeffree Star plays out for them. In late 2019, they also did another collaboration with James Charles, which was the James Charles mini palette, which I've talked about that before. I literally think that is like the biggest scam. I hate the James Charles. I actually like the original James Charles palette, the mini. I just thought that was such a stupid cash grab. Like I just disliked that a lot, but that's personal opinion. Something really interesting that happened in 2019 is Morphe actually got a new investor. It seems like they took over a majority share in Morphe. The investor is called General Atlantic. There was a bunch of articles written about this sort of merge at the time because the plan was to invest a ton of money into Morphe, basically, not only into making them as a brand better, but specifically there was a quote that they wanted to expand their portfolio of next generation beauty brands. So I think the kind of idea behind this investment is to make Morphe one of the top parent companies in the industry. You know how we have parent companies like L'Oreal own a ton of other brands underneath their umbrella? I think Morphe is trying to make a similar move. But I think what's really interesting about this is my hypothesis is that Morphe is trying to specifically be the umbrella company for influencer brands. So it's already heavily speculated, and I believe it was confirmed, but I'm not like 1,000% sure. Jaclyn Cosmetics is actually under the umbrella of Morphe, and it is now heavily speculated now that James Charles has announced his intent to launch a cosmetics company. It's very heavily speculated that James Charles's new brand will also be under this umbrella of General Atlantic and in turn Morphe. So my assumption is going to be that they're going to try to be the umbrella company and parent company for influencer brands. Like I said, in 2020, Morphe had to disassociate from Jeffree Star Cosmetics. And again, I think one of the main reasons they were some of the people that really had to do this, other companies like Beauty Bay, who are also associated with the brand, didn't, was because of how heavily Morphe and Jeffree Star were integrated into each other. Morphe very much makes the identity of their influencers a part of their own brand. So when their influencers screw up, it becomes a much bigger deal and a lot more blowback happens to them than might normally happen with other brands who work with influencers. In the summer of 2020, Morphe launched the Morphe 2 line, which really was honestly a very smart move. Like, to give them credit, the Morphe 2 line is genius. It's basically playing into kind of teenagers who want to use makeup. It gives me very like Florence by Mills Glossier vibes in the sense that it's all like light coverage makeup, cream blushes, cream products, like really not super pigmented lip glosses, like moving into that like lighter style of makeup that's very, very popular right now amongst all age groups, but especially younger kids. And they were also incredibly smart in that they used Charli and Dixie D'Amelio, who are like the queens of TikTok. They used the two of them to market these products. Now, while this was a little bit shady, just because they didn't make it abundantly clear that like Charli and Dixie weren't actually the collaborators of this. Like they made it seem like it was Charli and Dixie's makeup line. A lot of people thought that, when in reality, Charli and Dixie were just like the models for the campaign, which I don't know if that was meant to be purposefully deceitful, but with Morphe's history, I wouldn't put it past them to be purposefully deceitful. However, it really worked, and this whole Morphe 2 thing, as far as I can see, is actually going really well for them. It has very good reviews so far. I also think their use of TikTok stars really shows that Morphe has a very, very, very good understanding of influencer marketing and what kind of is new and popping and what they need to be paying attention to. They're seeing that while there is still value in YouTube beauty gurus, to attract a younger audience, they need to move to a place like TikTok where a lot of kids are and where a lot of kid kind of influencers are. So I think this shows that Morphe is very good at adapting and that they will continue to kind of be chameleon-esque through the beauty community and adapt really well to the ever-changing social media landscape. They've also done collabs this year with people like Madison Beer, Maddie Ziegler, now Nikita Dragon, so they're doing all these influencers collabs still. Ultimately, I think Morphe's main plan is to take this massive investment and to kind of make Morphe just a branch of their empire. I think they don't mind if Morphe is necessarily the star of the show. I think they want Morphe to kind of transcend into something very different than what it initially started as, which I think is very different than a lot of other makeup companies' goal, where their goal is to make their brand the best. They don't really care if their brand is the best. They want to acquire the best brands. I think that's kind of the direction they're going. So I think it puts a little bit less pressure on Morphe as a brand to be like the most successful, which I think is a really, really interesting strategy. I think the thing, just kind of reflective thoughts, I think the thing that's always bothered me probably the most about Morphe, and I know this is a little like, well, they're a business, so they don't have to. Their whole like motto, it's like the first thing on their About Them page, is this blend the rules idea. But aside from a couple of palettes, like the James Charles palette, I don't feel that there's ever really an emphasis on the makeup. Like Morphe is basically, instead of being a blueprint for how to put out interesting and exciting makeup that makes people feel inspired. Instead of that, they're basically a blueprint on how to do influencer marketing. Like if they were like an influencer marketing company, I would believe it. I think that's really where their strong suit lies. They don't have a lot of products that like spark this intense creativity or are super well made or are super interesting. And I think it's honestly just a little bit sad that a brand who very clearly doesn't even really care about the makeup side of things, they really only care about the business side of things. I think it's sad that they've become one of the more prominent brands and one of the more talked about brands when there are other brands who, while smaller, actually pour their heart and soul into the creative side of makeup. That is what consumers are really looking for. Kind of shows how important marketing is in the beauty space, actually. Morphe shows that it's not really about having like the best. It's about being the best at marketing what you're doing. They're currently one of the biggest makeup brands in the world, and they got there by being incredibly shady. And there's something about that that will always sit weird with me, of like all of these shadiness and all of this scandal, and they are still probably going to be one of the most successful makeup brands of this generation. Now, if there's one positive thing about Morphe, I think it is that they definitely showed other brands the impact that influencers can have, and definitely legitimized influencers in the marketing space, which I think was really needed. It gave a lot of legitimacy to influencers online, and they definitely brought the makeup industry as a whole into this new world. It just sucks that they had to be so shady and deceitful at pretty much every turn to get to this point. And that is the evolution of Morphe brushes and kind of everything about them. I had so much fun looking into this video. Morphe as a brand has always been what I'm super interested in, and I actually learned a lot kind of going through and looking at their history. So let me know what you guys think about this video down below. I hope you liked it. I was hoping it would be a shorter one, but based on the amount of time I've been filming, I don't think it is. I love you guys so much. I hope you like this video. If you did, please like and subscribe, or just subscribe, or do neither. Honestly, just so happy you're watching me. Thank you so much for being here. My merch, including my Glomus merch, that is on sale until November 30th with code Smokey in all caps. My social media and everything I'm wearing on my face, which includes, oh my god, I'm just such a shill. But I also, my Midas Cosmetics collab is on sale right now for Black Friday. I'm wearing it on my eyes today. I really obviously love the palette, so you can go check that out. All of that will be linked down below, along with links and information to the Georgia Senate runoff races that are happening on January 5th. Super important. Stay informed, stay involved. I love you guys so much, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!